Okay, Scott Jr., you wanna start us? Should I start?
Yep, I'll start it.
Okay. Good morning. I think we're on. Welcome to our webinar. The webinar is on the evolving topic of the Trump administration's hardball foreign policy. We call this Speak Loudly and Carry a Big Stick, which, as probably many of you know, it's a reference to Teddy Roosevelt and the Monroe Doctrine, the idea of combining peaceful diplomacy with a willingness to be tough and strong if needed. It was applied to Latin America. Apropos. My name is Tulio Vera. I am the interim CEO and president of Global Americans. Global Americans is a nonpartisan policy think tank. And although we're nonpartisan, we will speak with folks on every side of the political spectrum. Before I start introducing everybody, I want to call your attention to a paper we released, sorry, last night entitled Critical Issues for Latin America in 2025. It's a big paper that focuses in part on some of the issues that we're going to cover today. We try to be holistic in the sense of cover all the major issues, but some of them we'll talk about today. For today's webinar, we have a great lineup. We will touch on essentially Trump's foreign policy towards the Americas. But this has been very fluid set of days. It's changing by the day, and in framing the conversation, I want to point to two thoughts or perhaps criticisms regarding the first Trump term. One was in that election or after that election's results, it came as a surprise to many people. Hence, he has admitted, and many people have admitted, that that administration wasn't prepared, and everything moved probably more slowly than was optimal. Appointments took time, many posts went unfilled, things just didn't get done very quickly. And the second thing was that he promised that he would drain the Washington swamp, and he failed to do that. And that meant that the administration lacked some of the effectiveness that it had intended. Trump being Trump, if he was going to be given a second chance, which he's now being given, he was going to vindicate himself and over deliver. So the events of the last 2 weeks, because it was 2 weeks ago, feels like ages, but 2 weeks ago that it was inaugurated, have moved at a dizzying pace. There's so many issues we could talk about. We're going to try to keep it focused, going to try to keep it to the issues of foreign policy and how policy is shaping up after what happened with Colombia 10 days ago, which now seems like ages, and more recently with the threats of tariffs and whatnot. So it's my pleasure to have this conversation with three experts in the region. I want to welcome Scott McDonald, Sergio Guzman. I want to welcome Denise Dresser. The idea for today is we're going to go about an hour. Each speaker will present for about 10, max 12 minutes. I'm going to try to be strict about that. And after that, after they give their remarks, we will open to Q&A. Just as an FYI, Denise has to leave in about half an hour. So after her comments, she will have to drop off. And I will ask everybody when we go to the Q&A to just type in your questions into the chat function in Zoom, and we'll try to respond to all of them if possible. So let me start with Scott, who's going to frame the big picture, the macro. Scott McDonald is the chief economist at Smith's Research and Ratings. Prior to that position, he had a lengthy career in finance, worked as an advisor to the Office of the Comptroller in Washington, has taught at various universities, published numerous books. He has a PhD in political science from the University of Connecticut, and his current research is focused on energy transition, climate change, and the Caribbean. He is also a proud fellow and senior advisor to Global Americans. Scott, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tulio. I'll try to move things along here. As Tulio said, that I will provide a broad context, which is probably a bit heavy on the economic side. I think that while I agree with the speak soft, speak loudly and carry a big stick, perhaps a better quote to sum up where we are and how the Trump administration views the world is from the 19th century British statesman Lord Palmerston, who said, "We have no eternal allies and we have no perpetual enemies. Our interests are eternal and perpetual, and those it is our duty to follow." I think the Trump administration believes it's on a mission to level the playing field in trade relations, secure the borders, and take on Chinese influence in the Western Hemisphere. Thus far, it has come out guns blazing. It has been highly aggressive, nationalistic, and blunt. The term transactional is often used. Others would say bullying with little regard for friends and allies. Trump point two came into office with a well-defined plan to create shock and awe on the policy front, and with the ultimate goal of a radical change in the structure of the U.S. economy, its leading institutions, as well as U.S. relations with the rest of the world. From locking horns with Colombia over deportation and threatening Canada and Mexico with tariff wars, to the shutdown of USAID, Secretary of Rubio's trip to Central America and the Dominican Republic, and saber rattling over retaking the Panama Canal, U.S. Latin American Caribbean relations have, in a very short time, undergone a massive shift, giving considerable validity to Vladimir Lenin's quote, "weeks where decades happen." We've jammed in a lot in a very short period of time. One of the things I mentioned was the economic restructuring in the U.S. And that this is, if I digress a little bit here, I think it's important for people in Latin America, as well as the United States, to understand what is the main drivers of a lot of the changes. Uh, and I'll start off with a quote from Peter Navarro, who's a long-term Trump loyalist. He's an economist, and his view is basically we're going to take the U.S. economy back to the 19th century. The McKinley era has a particular appeal, but it's a period when you had very little income tax. Well, you had no income tax, no corporate tax, and tariffs were the main funder of the federal government. The US was also expansionist. You had Manifest Destiny, and you also had the period of the Spanish American War, the Panama Canal. So, what's the formula to get the United States back to being number one? And this is a very important aspect for Mr. Trump because the world is divided into winners and losers. And Mr. Trump does not like to be a loser. So, to give you an idea from Navarro, this is the economic side. Net tariffs will lower the U.S. trade deficit and thereby boost real GDP growth while slowing the transfer of U.S. assets into foreign hands, thereby preserving U.S. wealth. As domestic investment and production increases and supply chains become more stable and resilient, real wages will rise, inflation will fall, and our nation will be more secure. Add to this drill, baby, drill, and energy costs will lower. And the next great economic wave, AI, will be carried forward by cheap and badly needed energy sources, namely oil and gas. Tariffs are necessary to reduce the U.S. fiscal deficit and the swelling U.S. debt load. They will also make up for tax cuts and deregulation. It is worth noting that at the end of fiscal year 2024, the amount of money taken in for tariffs to the federal government was $77 billion, which equals 1.57% of GDP. U.S. federal debt stands at $36 trillion, with $3 billion paid per day on interest payments for the debt. That's over, and so that's a very large number, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done here to change things around through tariffs. The bottom line is that it's a return to the 19th century economic model used by the United States during that period of time, and you need to have a very active foreign policy to get a lot of these things done. I do not want to belittle the other aspects of Trump policy, which are to secure the border. Migration has been a very heated political topic here. It stretched the country's social fabric. The inflow of drugs, in particular fentanyl, has been a major concern for the U.S. For Americans age 18 to 45, the leading cause of death is fentanyl overdose. So there's a complex package of things which are going on here. Just to provide a very quick context, the U.S. involvement with trade throughout the 19th century was one of protectionism, protecting home industries. Tariffs played a very important role. You reached the high point probably in the 1920s, and certainly the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930 reverberates historically because it probably contributed to the road that led to World War II. After World War II, the US became more engaged with free markets or free market orientated policies. The Bretton Woods system was created with the IMF, GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades, which eventually led to the World Trade Organization, and US businesses went overseas. One of the issues that comes out of this was the development of the Rust Belt. US companies left the US. There was a hollowing out of US manufacturing, coal producing, steel producing. It hit the Northeast and the Midwest very strongly, and also places like Pennsylvania. Uh, I would say the apex for the free trade movement was 1992 with the signing of NAFTA. But there was an undercurrent that evolved here too of people wanting more protection. The loss of jobs was resented. We go through the 2010s, and globalization brings all sorts of further changes and reinforces this undercurrent that you have a lot of people being left behind. And at the same time, you have the rise of China as an economic power. In 2016, China's impact is felt because there's a record trade deficit with China of $246 billion. And this has finally got people's attention and brought both parties to have more of a consensus on the need to deal with China, but also protectionism. And on the policy side, we see that one, the sentiment about protectionism, make America great again, comes to play in getting Trump elected in Trump 1.10. There's a trade war in 2018 that's embarked with China, but also there's fights over steel and aluminum. And then you also have I would say, a bigger emphasis on industrial policy. And that starts with Trump and it goes on through the Biden administration. And the Biden administration, in many regards, was just as protectionist as the Trump administration. Maybe the final messaging was different. Trump cared about corporate profits more and getting American workers jobs, and Biden cared about getting good paying union jobs. But nonetheless, there was a coherence that developed between Democrats and Republicans on the trade issue and industrial policy. And you had the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, both of which are pretty much industrial policy. They're both sought to restore US businesses, to reshore US businesses, and to de risk from China. This takes us to today. There are four things at play as to how Trump 2.0 is approaching Latin American and Caribbean policies rather. One, Trump believes that the U.S. is big and a large market for those smaller economies in Latin America and the Caribbean. He can push them around. Two, does the country in question have a trade surplus or deficit with the U.S.? Big trade surpluses with the U.S. are bad and need to be rectified. Trade deficits hopefully get you a pass. Three, how close is a country to China? This applies to trade and investment, membership in the Belt and Road Initiative, free trade agreements like with Chile, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Peru, and Ecuador, and hopefuls like Honduras, and the depth of cultural ties through universities, media relations, and Confucius Institutes. And four is a very broad category, national security. Under this category falls border security with Mexico, migrants, cartel violence, and fentanyl, the need to secure supply chains for such things as rare earth metals, oil and gas, strategic metals, metals like lithium, copper, and graphite, which points to Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, and Peru. and migration, which points most heavily to Mexico, Central America, Cuba, Haiti, and Venezuela. This takes us to Colombia, and Sergio, I'm not going to steal your thunder on this. I'll be very brief. Colombia, in many regards, was a litmus test. Although Colombia has a trade deficit with the U.S. and has long been a close regional ally, uh, it also has been taking deportations of Colombians from the United States. There was a tussle recently. I think part of it is personalities. President Trump has I would say, to put it mildly, a prickly personality at times and loves the social media, has a big ego, and that's Gustavo Petro as well. And these two guys, basically Petro, in some ways, uh, I don't want to say picked a fight, but he certainly got the ball rolling by saying you're treating Colombian people badly by sending them back in military aircraft. And I guess they were handcuffed. And so he said, no, I'm going to turn you away. For the Trump administration, this was a challenge on their deportation policy. And the feeling, I think, was that if we back down with Colombia, then we're going to have a real problem with the rest of Latin America. And Trump went for the juggler. It was a draconian response. We'll lift tariffs on Colombian goods. No coffee, no flowers for Valentine's Day. And these things forced Colombia to rapidly back off. Colombia is worth mentioning as it relates to the rest of Latin America. And I'd say there are four things to consider. One is we are again on a 4 year roller coaster ride where political and economic dynamics become closely entwined. As CSIS's William Wrench noted, Trump thrives on chaos and keeping his adversaries off balance and discounts the effect that it has on increasing business uncertainty, if not panic. Two, the U.S. action was rapid and threatened escalation. Trump clearly had a bigger stick than Petro, which led to a quick caving in. Other Latin American and Caribbean countries, no doubt, took note. And three, communication. Trump has no compunction about bullying smaller countries, getting them to do what he wants, be it the acceptance of deportees, appointment of fentanyl czars, the movement of troops to the border to deal with drugs and human smuggling. And last but not least, the successful Colombian litmus test gave reassurance that the same approach could be used on Canada and Mexico. Where do we go from here? Latin America and the Caribbean face a radically changed geopolitical and geoeconomic landscape driven by a White House that harkens back to the McKinley era of expansionism, manifest destiny, think of the Panama Canal, Spanish American War, and a Monroe Doctrine 2.0. Outer gender, race, and climate change that the Biden administration led with, and in is transactional deal making where countries are going to have to prove their worth to trade with the US. Market access to the US is a reward for good behavior. Certain areas will fare better, like the Southern Caribbean energy matrix, Guyana, Suriname, and Trinidad and Tobago, neo-libertarian governments in Argentina and El Salvador, and those countries ready to move quickly to settle any issues with the larger power. I think there's probably going to be more noise over the Panama Canal, but the Panamanian government is scrambling to meet U.S. demands. I would just say the other aspect of this,
Scott, I'm going to have to interrupt you because we need to move on to the other speakers. I
sure,
apologize, but just
absolutely. Let me just, a couple quick things. One, a lot of this plays in favor of China. Two, geography is likely to be a factor. I think the countries geographically closer to the US are going to have less leeway in what they can do versus the other countries further in South America that have bigger trade relations with China. And I'll conclude with a question to the other panelists. Is Trump's tariff game and attached politics, deportation, and drug trafficking going to be a passing hurricane for Latin America and the Caribbean, or is it going to have a long lasting effect? That's it.
okay. Thank you, Scott. I'm aware of Denise's constraint, so I think I'm going to have Denise go first, if you don't mind, Sergio. just simply because I know she has another commitment. So let me quickly introduce Denise. She's a professor of political science at the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, ITAM. She has been a visiting researcher at various universities and think tanks in the US. And in terms of academic background, she obtained a bachelor's in international relations at El Colegio de Mexico and a doctorate in political science from Princeton University. Denise, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, going back to the initial question as to what happened there was a demonstration effect that if you fight Trump publicly and in a very frontal fashion, there will be immediate, swift, and brutal retaliation. So I think that set the stage for what happened later. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum adopted a position of wait and see versus announcing that she would immediately place tariffs. She left it vague, saying we're thinking of eventually putting tariffs on American goods and other non-tariff measures, but it was vague. And throughout the weekend, what happened is that Canada adopted a much stronger stance because it's in a less vulnerable position. And from the Mexican perspective, what we're seeing with Trump is Trump reloaded. We already lived this in his first term. Remember that Trump came into office and basically forced Mexico and Canada to renegotiate the North American Free Trade Agreement. And back then, President López Obrador accepted this, as well as making innumerable concessions to Trump. They had a good relationship. They were temperamentally similar. They wrote each other, friendly notes back and forth. López Obrador made a consistent and clear effort to appease the American president. And Mexico made numerous concessions, including sending 50,000 troops from the National Guard to the border. What López Obrador did not do, and Claudia Sheinbaum, the Mexican president, is now paying the price of that, is clamp down on fentanyl production. López Obrador always denied that we had a crisis. And he adopted a security strategy of abrazos no balazos, which essentially means hugs, not bullets, where he sought a policy of trying to negotiate with the cartels, hoping that that would diminish violence, and that proved not to be the case. If anything, we saw the territorial control and advance of drug traffickers occur throughout his term. And a State Department report argues that a third of Mexican territory is now under the control of drug traffickers or organized crime. And you see that specifically in certain states, in Chiapas, in Guerrero, Tabasco, Culiacán, Tamaulipas, Michoacán. So Claudia Sheinbaum comes into office and she faces, on the one hand, a Trump reloaded who has learned from his second term that tariffs can be a useful way of extracting concessions on other fronts that matter to him politically in terms of his own domestic agenda. And as you know, he turned immigration, fentanyl production in Mexico, fentanyl deaths in the United States, and loss of control of the border into key issues in the US election. So he needs to deliver in terms of the promises he made to his base. And he needs to deliver quickly. So I think the swift imposition or the threat of tariffs was meant to produce what it produced. In less than 2 days, Claudia Sheinbaum came back and said, I'm sending 10,000 more troops to the border. And her administration, since she's been in office over the past several months, has deliberately made a point of stepping back from abrazos no balazos and enacted a much more forceful, direct security strategy that is meant to take the cartels on, and also the seizures of fentanyl and the recognition that fentanyl is a problem in Mexico has become a centerpiece of her administration. Even though she publicly cannot break with López Obrador or criticize what he failed to do in his administration, in reality, you're seeing a different kind of approach. And she is also stressed, and did this in her Twitter, her ex public positioning, stressed collaboration, the need for collaboration. So Mexico gave Trump what it wanted. On Monday, he was able to say that the Mexican president had committed 10,000 troops to the border and was forcefully going to collaborate on border control. And Claudia Sheinbaum got what she wanted to, which was a reprieve, at least for a month. And there will be now these mesas de negociación, in which Marco Rubio, the Secretary of the Treasury, the U.S. Secretary of Commerce are going to participate. And this is buying her time. Now, the issue for Mexico is that it buys her time for 1 month, but the damage to the vision of North America and to the continuation of the USMCA is a question mark. We don't know how long Donald Trump will continue to push this adversarial position vis-a-vis his largest trade partners. Mexico became the U.S.'s largest trade partner in the last several years. Mexico exports 80% of its exports to the U.S. We are very vulnerable to changes in the rules in terms of its effect on the Mexican economy, on employment, on economic growth. Goldman Sachs, Standard and Poor's, a very good report published by the Council on Foreign Relations, argued that this was going to push, if enacted, the tariffs would lead to a recession in Mexico, to high inflation, and probably to the devaluation of the Mexican peso. And if you know Mexico, you understand that the parity of the peso is a sign of the psychological health of the economy, and it is something that Mexicans follow very closely. So she got a reprieve, but this it doesn't mean that North America is going to survive Donald Trump, because if he does insist, as he has made explicit over the past week, that the new golden era of the United States entails a different kind of industrial policy, returning manufacturing to the U.S., and using tariffs as a way of forcing American companies back to the United States, which, by the way, I think is unfeasible. And we saw the stock market react to that, because you can't even talk about the U.S. economy, the Canadian economy, the Mexican economy. It's one integrated economy. I think one of the things we all learned in the midst of this is that an American car, the parts of that car to assemble it, cross the border 8 times. The tariffs would also be hugely damaging to the United States, as most economists underscored over the past week, in terms of producing inflation in the United States, adding $3,000 to the price of every car, the 16 million cars built annually in the United States. The ultimate beneficiary would be China, taking advantage of the fact that Canada and Mexico are being forced to delink from North America. So the issue here, the long-term issue, is how long will Donald Trump continue to use tariffs on a monthly basis to extract concessions? And how many concessions can Mexico and Canada make? I mean, Canada actually doesn't have that much to offer in terms of the domestic agenda that is important to Trump, fentanyl, border control, and Mexico does. And so I think that Claudia Sheinbaum is going to be forced into a position of having to offer things to Trump on a constant basis. Either the head of a governor involved with corruption in Sinaloa, for example, or some high-level official from a past administration who had dealings with drug traffickers. And she'll have to send the heads of people that she decapitates politically to Donald Trump on a silver platter, so that he can use these concessions to say, you see, I'm getting something out of Mexico. I'm forcing them to address the fentanyl crisis. They are now, taking control of the border. And you're going to see, you're already seeing concessions from Mexico that happened even before the short-lived tariff war, which was accepting once again for Mexico to be a third safe country, the Remain in Mexico policy. In other words, preparing itself for massive deportations of Mexicans and people of other nationalities as part of Trump's new threat to use deportation as a way of making the lives of people who've crossed the border without documents very difficult. I think it's a strategy to deter people from coming, from staying, and possibly returning to their home countries. So Mexico has already made concessions. I think that is going to continue to be the case. But what Mexicans will see is probably a dual strategy whereby Claudia Sheinbaum in the morning press conference, which is from where she controls the narrative, she will continue to say, as she has, we have not bowed our heads. We are not ceding our sovereignty. We are negotiating with our head held high. Things that matter to her left-wing base and that matter to López Obrador, who continues to maintain, I think, a large political presence behind her, even though she is sitting in the presidential chair. And at the same time, perhaps not overtly or publicly, she will make concessions because Mexico is in a position of enormous vulnerability, and even more so as a result of the inaction of López Obrador on key fronts in the past 6 years. So expect to see this duality playing out and expect for Mexico to suffer the brunt of what Trump is doing, regardless of the reprieve, because the climate of living with the Damocles sword over your head is going to affect foreign investment in Mexico, long-term investment, plants and companies thinking, well, if this is going to fall apart, where do I integrate my supply chains? Do I seek other export markets? So that's why I think the key issue here is Trump really willing to fulfill his promise of America alone, ultimately, and destroying 30 years of integration in many areas, not only commercially, but culturally, politically. In Mexico, you're seeing the resurgence of an anti-American sentiment and calls for Mexico to defend its sovereignty, a kind of rhetoric that you hadn't seen in Mexico since the North American Free Trade Agreement was enacted in 1994. So all of this is going to have a political, an economic, and a commercial price. The only deterrent, I think, to Trump would ultimately be the reaction of the stock market, because I think that that's what forced him to renege on the threat of tariffs that we're going to start today, push it back a month, because as you know, the stock market basically collapsed on Monday. So there's a lot of uncertainty, so much that we cannot predict. But I believe that Mexico is going to be the loser in this climate of uncertainty because of our historic vulnerabilities and the asymmetry in power between the two countries.
Great. Thank you, Denise. If I could just get you to answer one question, since I know you had to go. You didn't mention China very much in your commentaries, and it didn't feature very much in the concessions that Scheinbaum made yesterday. But if your thought is that this is going to continue, or Trump is going to continue to extract concessions from Mexico over the medium to long run, at some point it seems sensible that he would get to China, right? How do you think about China? Tell me just quickly, where does it fit in this whole panorama that you described?
If you follow Latin America, you know that China has been making huge inroads in terms of investment and becoming a presence, building infrastructure, and branching out into many areas that serve China's interests, and they're also beneficial to the countries that it develops this investment relationship with. I think China's presence in Mexico is more vast and deep than has been publicly acknowledged, and this is probably one of the areas in which Trump is right about how Mexico has become the backdoor for China to enter the US market. It's interesting that this was not put on the table as an issue of concern. And the ultimate irony may be that the more the US pushes Mexico and Canada away, the more it's going to push Mexico into China's arms. And China has a strategic interest in terms of becoming a dominant power in the region, economically speaking. So I don't know if eventually, and I think this will come up in the mesas de negociación, these working groups that have begun. Probably the U.S. Commerce Secretary and the Department of the Treasury will start placing more pressure on Mexico in terms of blocking imports and stopping the clear investment drive that China is pushing in Mexico and in other countries in the region.
Okie doke. Thank you. Thank you very much, Denise. I know you have to go, so thank you on behalf of Global Americans and everyone. Have a nice flight.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation.
Pleasure.
I'm sorry I have to leave. Good morning.
No, ciao. Sergio Guzman. We're going to go to Sergio. He is the director and co-founder of Colombia Risk Analysis, where he provides commercial, security, and political risk analysis on the Andean region. Prior to that, he worked at Control Risks, a consultancy in Colombia, and he teaches at Externado University in Colombia. He received an MA from Johns Hopkins SAIS in International Economics and International Relations, and a BA from George Washington University. Sergio, let's hear about what's going on in Colombia. Thank you.
Thank you, Tulio, and it was very enlightening to hear you, Scott, put this into very neat bullet points into what it means. I have a few more to offer because I think there are large relations that can be made, or connections that can be made from a Latin American point of view that I think are interesting to point out, because both you and Denise seem to talk about, how Latin America is now in a really bad position and how we're very vulnerable to the US. I would offer that this also opens a lot of Latin Americans' eyes to the urgent need to diversify its economic relations, its political relations, and why not its military alliances. And this, as many critics have noted, plays right into the US adversary's hands. But this is not gunboat diplomacy, where Latin America didn't have many options. Now there's many suitors on the table, and Latin America is preparing to do just that. Anecdotally, the same day of Trump's inauguration was the 45th, was the celebration that the Chinese embassy put on of the 45th commercial China-Colombia relations. And during that meeting, the Chinese ambassador was very emphatic to say China is a dependable ally that doesn't mess in internal politics and that has a huge market with a lot of opportunities for trade between both partners. And so I do think that if before November, many Latin American countries were thinking about diversifying, but were waiting until the results of the election. After November, they said, okay, well, we'll make it happen. And after January 20th, they were sort of like saying, well, let's see how it plays out. I think definitely after January 26th, when it was the Colombia issue, I think a lot of people were jolted into action, because we did foresee, and we had spoken with Tulio right after this happened, that Petro was not going to be on Trump's good list, right? There were a lot of categories that had Petro playing out against Trump because of his, perchance for populism, or his very verbose social media account, or how, Petro wants to recreate some of Hugo Chavez's pan-Latin American nationalism to his favor. But we weren't expecting, like you said, Scott, for him to hit the jugular so hard, for him to pinpoint Colombia's weaknesses and try to play Colombia as an example to other countries. Because if you see in the first 2 weeks of his administration, as opposed to target US adversaries, Trump has targeted US allies and countries that have a values based relationship with the United States, not just a transactional commercial relationship, but countries with which the US sees eye to eye on critical issues. Colombia is the place where 90% of US cocaine comes from. And Petro, for his faults, has been fighting that war with the US. Petro has also been receiving Venezuelan migrants, housing them in Colombia, and had a couple of centers where people could apply for asylum in the US here. And so the goodwill that Colombia and many other Latin American countries had towards the US is quickly evaporating. Now, of course, there's like the personal aspect of this, because if Petro was in the we're probably not gonna get along with this guy great list the first week. The second week is like right at the top of the shit list. And that's going to have consequences for Colombia as a whole, not just for Petro personally and for his relationship to the United States, but it's also going to make other Latin American countries think about their position. Now, I think from a Latin American perspective, this comes at a really bad time for a number of reasons. First is there's and what this crisis with Petro underscored was that there's no unity in Latin America. As you remember, Petro invoked an emergency meeting of CELAC that didn't reach a consensus on the final statement, perhaps because some members, like Petro, wanted the communique to read much stronger against the US, and others feared that this will bring retaliation by Donald Trump, particularly in the mood that he was in, because he essentially did bring Colombia and the Colombian business sector to its knees because of Valentine's Day, number one, but also because 26% of Colombian exports and imports come from the United States. It's a vital, vital country for our economy. And that vulnerability is expounded the further north you go. Mexico, 70% of exports to the US. Countries like Nicaragua, 60% of exports. Guatemala, another very dominant player. The Dominican Republic, etc. So Trump knows Latin American weaknesses very, very well, and is very serious about expunging them. Now, that action won't come without consequences. He may not think that there are consequences now, and he may feel like he's winning, but I think he's creating a lot of bad blood in Latin American societies that the US had tried through a lot of soft power and through a lot of trade relationships to improve over many, many administrations. And so I think that the disunity in Latin America is something that is not going to be fixed, because many Latin American presidents are at odds with one another. And there will be elections this year and next year in places like Brazil, Colombia, Chile, that are going to make changes to those administrations. But you also see a very pressing lack of leadership in inter-American institutions. The OAS is not going to be a forum for discussion. CELAC has no. Petro is going to be president of CELAC. He doesn't get along well with Milei. He doesn't get along well with Dina Boluarte. So how is that Latin American unity going to come about? And for much fanfare and much sort of like online commentary that Trump draws, he is desperate to be taken seriously. And I think a lot of Latin Americans were sort of like not very affected by the first Trump administration in a very significant way. And I think in the second administration is going to change very, very significantly. But what I do think is important, and we haven't talked about USAID quite significantly, is the very predominant role in humanitarian assistance that US funding had in the region. Humanitarian assistance that was not taken care of by any other ally, not European countries, not Asian countries like Japan or Korea or Australia or New Zealand, they were much more focused in their regions of interest. The US was the dominant player when it came to humanitarian assistance and international development assistance all throughout Latin America. And that is going to leave a huge vacuum that is not going to be filled potentially by other states and other states with similar values and visions. And so you're not going to see Norway all of a sudden substitute the 70% of US humanitarian assistance that Colombia receives, period. And so those vacuums are going to be filled not by states, but by criminal armed organizations, because you also don't see a level of generosity from the Chinese that are going to see this as an opportunity to raise the gap or to meet the gap that is going to happen. So I do fear that this is going to have it's going to leave a permanent mark on the weakness of the states in Latin America and how that power relationship with organized crime. But also, and I think the other points that I wanted to make is Trump. We had the first Trump, and people thought, well, this will pass, and we'll come back to the U.S. Dominated world order under Biden. But now that didn't last, the U.S. is not looking like a very reliable ally. So even if something happens in 2028, that there's a change in administration somehow, what assures Latin American countries that they won't have a Trump-like figure 4 years later in 2032? And so I think the dependability of the United States is now very much in question, and not just for Latin America, but for everybody else. And I just wanted to finish with the point that I started, and that is maybe in gumbo diplomacy, we were in a less globalized world where the U.S. was, the shining star and the most important sort of country to be tethered to. In a globalized world, that's no longer the case. And in a globalized world, Latin America has many more options.
Thank you, Sergio. Thank you very much. Okay, so let us go to the Q&A now. Let me remind everybody there's a Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So if you could type any questions that you may have there, we'll take as many as we can. But let me throw the first one out at Sergio. Sergio, if you could maybe talk a little bit more about the future of free trade between the U.S. and Colombia, particularly the free trade agreement that Colombia has with the U.S. And I'm thinking here of something that I think you mentioned before we started this conversation today. There was an announcement yesterday by Ecuador that they were imposing 25% tariffs on Mexico, while at the same time they were beginning to negotiating an FTA with Canada. So what seems to be happening is like we're in this kind of all-out trade war that the Trump initiatives have triggered. So maybe your thoughts on that, how Colombia, and maybe if you have any on the Ecuadorian situation would be great.
Well, I think what's interesting, and Scott was mentioning this before, Colombia wasn't supposed to be the principal target. We hadn't heard a lot about Colombia in the campaign. We'd heard quite a bit about, Mexico and migration, and the inauguration speech brought Panama to the center of the stage. But then Colombia gave Trump his real first opportunity to show that he meant business. I think Ecuador, Novoa is in his own campaign, which starts next week. So I think that this is a lot of showmanship by Novoa. But I do think that Trump is going to use the leverage that he has over Latin America, economic principally, to begin pushing more and more. I don't think we're in a trade war within Latin America at the moment, but I also I'm very expectant to see how Brazil sort of decides to use and take advantage of this opportunity for its own purposes. Adding more members to the BRICS, for instance, could be a clear one. Adding more members to the Belt and Road Initiative for China would also be important, although as I mentioned earlier, China is also not budgetarily speaking in the best place to, this is not 2010, where we had the commodity boom of some sort. So the world is much more different than it used to be. But it's also there's also an introduction of the issue of scarcity that we didn't have in prior moments of geopolitical expansion.
Thank you. I don't know if Scott has any observations on this and maybe FTAs in Latin America writ large.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things that um, I don't think we've touched on. The FTAs represent a legal challenge, which it can be tied up in courts for a long time. Unilateral action, executive orders can, I think, temporarily disrupt them. But then the question is, what's the lasting nature of an executive order? And, I mean, ultimately the issue is, do agreements just add up to a piece of paper like Belgium neutrality in World War I and World War II? And it goes back to the reliability issue. And I don't think everybody in the Trump administration thinks that way. I think there is a core of people that believe you have to have some decorum in international affairs. I was going to just add one thing which we didn't touch on. We've talked a lot about the Trump administration using the stick, but there are carrots here, and they're maybe they're far and few between right now. But one of the things that came up in the very last days of the Biden administration was that the Inter-American Development Bank, sorry, the Exim Bank, U.S. Exim Bank, made a loan to Guyana. It was like $546 million. It's a public-private project, and the goal is to tap Guyana's natural gas pipelines and to overhaul its energy generation public utilities. I think that public-private dimension going forward is going to be used, and I think it does hold out a potential, I don't want to say soft diplomacy, but it certainly is a carrot in what is otherwise a lot of rocks. And I think that's important. It's got to be considered. It's not, it looks grim right now for most of Latin America and the Caribbean as to where the U.S. relationship goes, but there are other things at play here. And I would say the last thing, very, very quickly, is that the Trump administration represents one vein of U.S. thinking and approach to Latin America. There are others that have different views. And even within the Republican Party, there are people that prefer things in a more traditional stance and to work with Latin America. So,
Okay,
But it
thank
also
you.
seems those
Yep.
people are not very outspoken right now,
no,
because
they're not.
what
No,
is
no,
I,
certainly
happening?
not.
I don't disagree with you, Sergio. All I'm saying is, though, they are there.
Right.
And the Democrats are strangely muted on most of this. So,
Yep. Yep. A question for Sergio. Geography, and this is from Maritza Lewis. Geography is destiny, and Latin American and the Caribbean peoples vote with their feet. Even if a U.S. government is no longer dependable, as you say, where else can the region look for reliability?
Well, I think the problem is nowhere, because I don't think Europe at the moment is very willing to engage with Latin America on issues that are not central to their interests, such as energy. And they're very willing to engage on renewable energy with countries like Brazil, agriculture, they're willing to engage in. But when it comes to the defense of democracy and human rights, they prefer that power to be left elsewhere in terms of fighting against transnational criminal organizations. For many European countries, it's a policing thing that they need to work with border patrol in their own countries to secure, not necessarily to strengthen Colombia's military or Mexico's military or Guatemala's military to engage with the cartels, something that the US had no qualms about doing. And I think the problem with this assistance receiving a stop work order as a blanket and not on a case-by-case basis, is that it leaves a lot of people who are US allies, who want to work with the US, sort of in duress at their most pressing time. And that is something that will not be necessarily forgotten
Yeah.
when the funds begin to flow again. So reliability, I think, in alliances is important and is something that buys you much more than goodwill, or it buys you temporary goodwill, but not
Yeah.
permanent.
Okay. Thank you. I realize we're at the hour, so I'm gonna read one more question from the participants. This is from George Florio. Could any of the panelists comment on where Maduro's Venezuela fits into the discussion for both U.S. policy and for Latin American unity? Who wants to take this one?
I'll take a stab, but Sergio has to make a comment too. I think Venezuela is kind of the odd man out here. You look at Secretary of State Rubio's comments on Venezuela. The Trump administration was very hawkish, as Trump 0.10. However, I think there's some degree more flexibility this time, surprisingly, than I thought initially. And I think we had a deal that released a number of American prisoners that got out. I would not be surprised to see a deal where Venezuela takes on more of the people that are deported in return for allowing Venezuela to continue the oil flow north to U.S. refineries. And I think the aspect of and Trump administration mind that look, we gave supporting the opposition a go at it. It didn't take us anywhere, so why go down the same road again, which is a cul-de-sac? So the best thing for us is to be more flexible. We don't like Maduro, but we have to tolerate him and somehow deal with him.
Agree. Sergio, any
Yeah, no, and
thoughts?
just to finalize, I think the U.S. administration itself doesn't know what to do here because you not only you have Rick Grenell trying to cut deals, but you have Marco Rubio who's made it a, a personal point to fight against authoritarian dictatorships in Latin America, and that includes Venezuela, but also Cuba and Nicaragua. And you also have Mauricio Claver Caron working on this issue, and it's not necessarily a 2-on-1 that's going to make this discussion play out in Trumpers. I think that this is going to be something that Trump is going to look at. What gives me the victory of the day? How can I dominate the news cycle with this? And the Venezuelans are going to be, unfortunately, pawns in all of this situation because it's 600,000 Venezuelans on TPS in the United States. It's 1.9 million Venezuelans here in Colombia. And potentially, if the economic situation turns very sour in Venezuela because of X, Y, or Z, or sanctions, or whatever, or oil prices switch all of a sudden, they're going to be coming here and they're going to be trying to find their way up north. And so, in a way, it may be a lot of short-sighted thinking, but I don't see a strategy here in that sense.
Okay. Well, gonna wrap this up on the happy note of the Venezuela topic. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Sergio, Scott, and Denise, who already left. Reminder to look at that paper we released last night, Critical Issues in Latin America 2025. You can find that in our website. And thanks to everybody that joined us. Have a happy Tuesday. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.